Okay, so I'm going to start us off by introducing myself and introducing NAPO, Indigenous Nations Poets. Some of you are very familiar with NAPO, as I can see some of you here have been fellows, and others may be new to Indigenous Nations Poets. So thank you so much for showing up to this workshop. So Indigenous Nations Poets was founded in 2020 by Dr. Kimberly Blazer, whom many of you know. And she brought a group aboard on right away and said, let's start brainstorming and growing this organization. And we have been for the last 3 years growing really fast. We're a national Indigenous poetry community. We're committed to mentoring emerging writers and nurturing the growth of Indigenous poetic practices and raising the visibility of all Native writers, past, present, and future. We also recognize the role of poetry in sustaining tribal sovereignty and Native languages. So that's becoming increasingly an important part of our work with NAPO is supporting Indigenous language revitalization. We've had 2 annual retreats, having annual mentoring retreats where we invite people to apply to become NAPO fellows. And then each year we have a retreat for those fellows, and then the next year some of the returning fellows come back. And so that's how we're kind of growing our community. And the retreats, our mentoring retreats, they're about a week long. And last year we focused on ecopoetics. This year we're going to focus a lot on language revitalization. Our first retreat was in 2022, and that took place in Washington, D.C., and it coincided with Joy Harjo's poet laureateship, the conclusion of her term as U.S. Poet Laureate. So it was a really exciting time. We haven't identified where we'll have the retreat. We're still working on the logistics for this coming year, but we'll start sending information out about it probably around maybe December and start inviting applicants. But in addition to our mentoring retreat every year, we want to increase our programming and outreach to a wider community because we want to keep expanding our community. And part of that is doing things like this workshop. We've had a few already, some of our fellows in the past. We invited to give a workshop or invited people to propose workshops that could be given free and open to the public. And now we're just trying to keep up with that. So I'm on the board, I'm the treasurer of NAPO, and I thought it would be fun to give a workshop and start growing more people paying attention to things that NAPO can do. I think that's about a basic introduction. I do want to, we have our coordinator here, Jody Vandermolen, if you want to say hello, and also Annie Winstrup, to introduce 2 of our staff members. So if you send an email to Indigenous Nations Poets or want to get in touch, these are some of the folks who will respond to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yagali do. I'm Annie Winstrup. I'm the Donor and Fellow Relationship Coordinator. I'm so excited to see all of you here tonight with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie.
And I'm Jody Vandermolen, Operations and Programming Manager. And we'd love for everybody to introduce yourself in the chat and where you're zooming in from. I'll be doing the hosting tonight here. So nice to see everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for putting introducing yourself in the chat. That would be wonderful. Gives us a sense of who's here, where you're all zooming in from. That'd be great. So Jody's going to put in the chat also a link to our website, indigenousnationspoets.org, where you can also find more information about us, keep up to date with news and other events, find out how to follow us on social media. And we're also always on a fundraising campaign. We're only 3 years old, so we're growing really fast and growing really big. So fundraising is increasingly important. So if you're interested in what we do, we encourage you to follow us and support us as well. So we have a fundraising page that you can reach through our website, where there's a direct link for our Kindful fundraising page. So, right, so let's get started. I'm gonna try and keep a close eye on the clock since we have an hour and a half, and I'm already 2 minutes behind. So I'm terrible with keeping time. A little bit about me. So I'm a treasurer of the board of NAPO. I'm also a poet. I have 3 books out. My recent is called The Maybe Bird from a great publisher called The Song Cave. I live in San Francisco. I'm Muscogee Creek through my mother's side. And I also teach at the Institute of American Indian Arts as a continuing education program, their MFA in creative writing program. And I teach at the Rainier Writers Workshop as well for their MFA program. I'm so happy to see Kathy. Hi, I'm glad to see you here. Kathy's in one of my II classes, and I see Matt. Hey, Matt, also in the MFA program, and Calais, also from Rainier Writers Workshop. So good to see y'all. That's a little bit about me. I wanted to do a class talking about the image. 2 things that I love most about poetry is what a poem can do with imagery, how it can hold and change imagery. The other thing I love about poetry is music. And I think those 2 go hand in hand. But for me, those are the 2 main craft aspects of poetry that are most exciting. When I started writing when I was younger, just, like scribbling in my journal, I always liked to write as a kid. I always wanted to describe what I could see, describe the things that I thought were beautiful. The things that just were stunning, the things that we didn't have words for. I wanted to be a visual artist because I thought that would be the way to capture the things that I saw that were beautiful. But I also wanted to capture or somehow convey, or really, it's really about sharing with others, because it's not capturing it, it's not taking it, and it's not even sharing it, but it's about not being alone with that, not being alone, right? Some way to communicate with other people. And I was never a good visual artist. 2-dimensional stuff is really not my forte at all. Design is not my forte. Language is also not my forte. Language is very difficult for me. But I decided, well, I'll go with poetry. Why? Because I feel like words can not just depict something, but hold all of the aspects of itself. If I take a picture or I make a painting, it's harder for me to bring in all the things that that object, that thing I'm seeing, or that scene is interrelated. But somehow poetry feels like a place where you can bring in the past, the future, all the things that scene is related to. And it allows a transformation. Poetry is something that is about inviting others to participate in making meaning, rather than telling someone, this is a point I want to make, this is a meaning I want to convey. So imagery is a complicated thing. When I think about what an image is, oftentimes in poetry, it's not a 2-dimensional object. It's not a static representation, but it's a way that the poem moves and shifts through time and space. I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to be showing some slides. So if you're, you don't have to take notes. And if anyone wants access to the PowerPoint, at the end of the class, I'll put my email in and you can email me and I can send it to you. So I'll pull that up right now. Here we go. Okay. Also, I invite anyone to add questions or put things in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on it. But also, I welcome you to just turn off your mute button and say, hey, I have a question, because if I don't see the chat or I'm talking too fast, I really do want to welcome conversation. There's a big group and I'm going to be doing a lot of talking. So I want to say at the beginning, please interrupt me and ask questions. I'm very open to that. So what is an image? Of course, one could say, well, an image is a pictorial likeness, something that illustrates an idea, an object, or an action. In poetry, I think about imagery as something, most importantly, that appeals to the senses. It's in the poem, imagery is what calls up the physical sensation. It's writing about pictures, it's describing scenes, it's also using figures of speech. It's a way to bring energy and story into a poem. But what I think is so powerful about an image in a poem or imagery in a poem is the way that it does activate the sensory. Sensory is essential. A lot of people say, I just don't get poetry because it doesn't make sense. But I really believe in, well, maybe because we're not thinking about sense in the sensory way. We're thinking about sense in the idea of the rational mind. And our rational mind is trained to make sense of things in a particular kind of way. We follow rhetorical structures, we understand storylines in a way, but poetry doesn't always follow those structures. And we feel like, well, it's not appealing to my rational mind, but it can appeal to the physical, spiritual body, mind space. And that's where it becomes, that's where it makes a kind of a different kind of sense, but a more holistic kind of sense. I always liked Ezra Pound's definition of an image. An image is that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. To me, that is just an awesome definition, because it talks about, it's not just an intellectual idea or concept, but it's also emotional. And it's not just a concept, but it's a complex, meaning it's full embodiment. And it's in an instant of time. So a whole poem, once you read the poem, usually we experience in a split second, even if it takes us time to get from the first line to the last line. Once we've experienced the poem, it all exists in one moment. I think it was Donald Hall who said that in logic, no two things can occupy the same point at the same time. In poetry, that happens all the time. This is almost what poetry is for, to be able to embody contrary feelings in the same motion. So I think about image as innately linked to transformation in a poem. It allows for the poem to be a dynamic act of discovery, as opposed to a report of a static observation. Imagery is something that can help bring the transformation in. It acts as a vehicle to move ideas. It adds energy to the language, and it also can lead to a transformation of meaning. So when I think about writing about objects or things in a poem, there's a complex of particular feelings that are associated with any object. And for every person, that complex is different. We come to the object with our own associations. By paying attention to the details of the objects and the images that we're including in our poetry, and the objects and images that are surrounding us, we will come to a range of new ideas and discoveries that we didn't know were there before, if we're paying attention to not just what the object looks like, but what that object suggests, what we can associate with it. So there's a poet, the French poet Francis Ponge, he was a prose poet, and he based most of his poems on concrete imagery rather than ideas. And I like returning to his poems as a reminder that you don't have to begin a poem with an idea. In fact, when you begin a poem with an idea, oftentimes, well, at least if I do, I get lost, because I get so lost in how am I going to make this idea come across or prove my point, that I forget to listen to the images and the words and the information that they may be carrying. I'm almost not listening to my own unconscious. So beginning with an image can be a great way to begin a poem. Ponge wrote about a pebble. This is a quote from Francis Ponge. It is less a matter of observing the than installing oneself in its heart and seeing the world with its eyes. Like the novelist who, in order to portray his heroes, lets himself sink into their consciousness and describe things and people as they appear to him. So going into the object and imagining that you are the object and seeing the world with the eyes of that object is one way to begin, to enter into that complex of feelings. So I want to invite you all now to pull out a pen, or if you're on your laptop, type. But I want you to write down a few things. We are going to do a little writing exercise, by the way. Oops, we're not quite there yet. Okay, so I want to invite you to write down 5 nouns or objects. And if you can't think of anything, if you have a book nearby, pick it up. What I like to do sometimes when I'm stuck is just pick up any old book that's sitting around and open it to a random page and flip through it and pull out words that strike you. It also takes the mind out of it. You're not thinking, well, what's a cool word? You're just finding words and putting them down. So write down at least 5 objects or nouns, things. And then after that, at least 5 adjectives, things that descriptor words, and 5 verbs or action verbs. I'll give you a few minutes. So 5 nouns, 5 adjectives, and 5 verbs. Okay. Give you just a few more seconds so I can now look in the chat and see who y'all are. Great. Right. Okay. I'll just put that in there as a reminder. I'm really big into list making and gathering language wherever I can find it. Because I'm not very good at language, if I sit down to a blank page, I can never think of words. They just don't come to me. So what I do to deal with that is prepare myself by having notebooks filled with words. And I start there. The words themselves will suggest ideas to me rather than beginning with an idea and trying to find words. So 5 nouns, 5 adjectives, 5 verbs. We will do something with these words in a moment. All right. So I want to talk about 2 distinct types of poetic imagery, the literal image and the figurative image. So the literal image is just the actual thing, and it can be quite detailed and described. A turquoise scarf, for example, that's maybe the thing. And maybe you add a whole lot of other descriptors to the scarf, but the actual image is a scarf. The figurative is when it departs from the actual and it implies a comparison. So the scarf as turquoise as tropical water. So you're seeing the color of the scarf and it's reminding you of something else. And maybe the feel of the scarf, the action, the movement of the scarf feels fluid, liquid, watery. So that's the difference between literal and figurative. Pretty simple, kind of. Gets a little more complicated. So within that idea of the 2 types of poetic imagery being literal and figurative, whether you're talking about literal or figurative language, description is involved. The key, I think, to creating evocative, literal, and figurative imagery in a poem is activating the sensory. The way the poem is vivid, it's vivid in the way that it uses its imagery primarily. That's how the vividness of a poem comes across, how it uses imagery. How it describes or presents that image. If it presents just a scarf, right, we don't see it as much. It becomes increasingly vivid when we add sensory details to that scene, object, or experience. This is where concrete and abstract diction come in as very important to poetic imagery. Concrete diction are words that denote that which can be perceived by the senses. So basically, it's anything that you can sense. We know our top 5, right? Sight, smell, sound, touch, taste, visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, gustatory. Those are more fancy words for that. Those are like the first 5. Definitely not all of them. But these kinds of diction is the kind of words that are being used. That's what diction means, the kinds of words that you choose for the poem. The concrete diction is responsible for the way one experiences the poem. If I read a poem that says the light came into the room, I might experience that, but not as fully, not as sensorially as if I know that it's a dim light. So you're adding a visual detail to that light, and it's concrete. A pounding surf, again, I know what the waves are like with that little added detail. The rough floor, the tactile, I can feel it. The gustatory, the taste, the bitter tang. So concrete diction has its opposite, which is abstract diction. And abstract is, we often think abstract in terms of like, oh, the poem is very abstract, meaning it doesn't, it's kind of like an abstract painting. It doesn't, it's not specific to a thing. So that's kind of what abstract diction is like in a way. More specifically, abstract diction usually points to a category, like beauty, terror, fear. It's a feeling, but it doesn't activate a sense. I like to think of it as a feeling that could be like the sensory experience could be variable among different people. In other words, if I find something beautiful, I cannot be convinced that you're going to find it beautiful too, because my version of beauty is going to be different from everyone else's. My fears are different from everyone else's. My terror, what is strange to me, will be different. So if the poem is about inviting readers into your experience so that the readers don't just sit in their minds and try to figure out what the poem is about, but instead they experience it fully, they enter into the poem and they contribute, they participate in making meaning with you. If you use just abstract diction, it's less likely that that person is going to be creating their own. They're so far, if you say it is a beautiful day, I really don't know what the poet means by that. I'm going to invent my own version of beautiful day, but I'm going to feel really separate from the poem because I have no way of knowing if, you know, if I'm close, if I'm close or getting it. If you give me a little more concrete diction, I can relate to it. The more, just like in a story, the more specific that story is to a unique person's experience, the more we relate to it. It becomes universalized, the more specific it is. So the same goes for poetry. Oops. So there are more than 5 senses, as we all know, but it's just interesting to think about this because also in our writing, you want to consider, you know, you think, well, okay, what is it? You know, how do you describe fear? What does it taste like? What does it smell like? What does it look like? All those things. We've done this, you know, most in our creating writing life is thinking about these 5 senses. But it's really helpful to think about all the others that you can bring into your sensory description, into your concrete diction. So the big 5 are only there because they were first classified by Aristotle in his work De Anima. But there are actually hundreds of senses. A sense is a group of sensory cells, actually physically in the body, that respond to a specific physical phenomenon and corresponds to a particular region in the brain where signals are received and interpreted. That's from his website called Sensory Trust. But basically, the brain is very much involved in these sensory details and calculating them. So just a few of the other senses to get a sense of how many there are. The sense of heat, thermoreception. I love this magnetoreception, the ability to detect the Earth's magnetic field. Birds have a very strong magnetic reception, right? Nocioception is a perception of pain. Equilibrioception, the perception of balance. Proprioception, you may have heard of that, the perception of body awareness. I know like how to touch my foot, even though I don't see my foot, because I sense the body there. I sense where it is. Chronoception, the sense of time passing. It's important to think about how many hundreds of sensory senses we have, because I think it equalizes us as humans. Not all of us have the same kinds of sensory perception. Some don't hear or see, but they have other aspects of hearing or audio things that come in to experience that. When you think about how to describe what something looks like, realizing that the sense of sight can involve the sense of color as well as the sense of brightness and motion. These are distinct things. The color of something, you can add to your description of what something looks like color-wise if you also consider the brightness of the color, the dimness of the color, and the motion, how the color is moving. Because in our eyes, we have cones and rods, and the rods are responsible for sensing motion. And then when you think about the neural systems involved in touch, just that sense of the tactile, if you want to bring in the tactile to your poem, what something feels like when you touch it, consider not just the texture, but also the vibration, the changes in pressure, and types of physical force. So just a little, I wanted to kind of introduce a few of these other types of sensory perceptions. It's a really interesting topic. Okay, any questions so far? I'm going to pause here and see if anyone has something to ask or offer up.
Hey Jennifer, it's Melanie Archuleta.
Oh, hi, Melanie.
So I've actually been thinking about this a lot, because I've been struggling with image. And it's like, what if this feeling was a color? And
Yeah.
because I totally got lost in like, this is my goal, it completely just destroyed my poem. It was nothing like what I wanted it to be. So like hearing that, like, not to really have a goal is the goal.
Oh, yes. No, that's great. Yeah, I kind of think so. You know, to release the pressure of that goal. We have a lot of pressure in our life, all of our goals of our daily lives. It's helpful to think of poetry as a place where we can excuse ourselves from that goal, because we might actually know some deeper other part of ourselves might know more than we think we do, and has its own goal that might hide itself from us, you know? When you said that about color, that you had a feeling for something, but there was a color attached to it, do you want to expand on that a little? That's very interesting.
So yeah, I guess just going through what I've been going through the last couple years, my uh my I guess my gauge, my weird gauge is my neutral point is melancholy.
Mhm.
Um and I was like, that's such a weird space for me, and a weird space for me to like admit that, hey, maybe that's where I start. And I can be happy, and I could probably be like depressed, but that seems to be like my midpoint. And I was like, but what is it about that feeling? Because there's something, it's more than just living that experience. It's the way it actually feels to me, right? And it's the absorption of like what really is around me, and the way that certain things might feel. Like some people would attach like blue to depression.
Mhm.
And I would say, okay, that's probably just like honestly a function of writing for me at this point, because it's so many people describe it that way. But I was like, well, what if it was like this blue, or even this like flower, that there are still bits of light in there. So even when something might feel dark, there's still more to it. There's never really this absolute darkness, at least in my experience,
Yeah, yeah.
that there's always something, peering through. There's always a piece of like some light, like just shining through somehow.
Yeah.
I don't that's as far as I got, because like I said, the whole goal distracted me.
That's wonderful to hear. I think it is a way in, we sit down to write and think, okay, what am I feeling? Either what am I feeling, or what do I believe in that I want to convey? What message do I want in this poem? And that can be really overwhelming. But if we enter in through something small, and I think entering in through image work can be one way in. Um, and so thinking about, okay, blue is an association with a feeling, focus in on that. All the senses that come to you with that color. And poems will grow out of that. That's like the hummus for the growth of the poem. So thank you for sharing that. And it also brings up another kind of figurative language we're going to talk about for briefly, of synesthesia. So when you actually experience, multiple senses. So When I touch something, when I feel a particular texture, I might smell something. One sense activates another, and it's actually a cool thing. And it's really the neural pathways kind of crossing, the sensory receptors communicating with one another and crossing. A lot of rich figures can come out of synesthesia and synesthetic experience. So it's just a little writing exercise. So you can practice literal and figurative, and also concrete diction. So literal, again, it's just the thing itself, what you see, not implying any comparison, but the description of the thing. So for each of these two images here, write one literal description, and try to engage more than one sense, not just what it looks like, but if other senses come to mind, what's the texture? Sometimes I find it helpful if I'm trying to describe something I see to ask questions of the image, the thing that I'm seeing. Consider what's in motion. How are you moving? How are the materials in you that I'm looking at interacting? What is visible and what might be not visible? What is that thing you see covering up? What might be heard in the scene that's presented? What might be smelled, and what the objects feel like. So I'll give you a few minutes to write towards these images. But remember to stay with the literal. I'll give you 2 more minutes just so you know your timing. Okay. Right. In the second minute. Did anyone find themselves writing figurative language?
Oh,
Any-
like the entire time. Yeah.
Yeah. What's an example? A moment where you thought, wait, this is figurative.
I thought that the fronds looked like filing cabinets on these mushrooms or on these fungi. Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool. Anyone else? I experienced that as well. Matt.
I had to resist similes, so I kept crossing out as. I kept having as's in there, and I just kept getting rid of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's quite difficult, especially, well, for certain, I think for certain minds, right? I mean, maybe some of us are geared with more literal and some more figurative. I don't know. But it also reminds us how important figurative is even for our own participation in the image. When I looked at, these mushrooms, because I don't know the language of mushrooms very well, I didn't have a lot of literal language that I thought was like, this is what I see, right? There's moss, but maybe it's a kind of an algae, all these. So it brings up how even for our own interaction with something that we see, that we often go to the figurative to help us understand it a little more. Like saying they look like filing cabinets, that's a way. It's almost as if, if I said to you, if you'd never seen a mushroom before on the tree and I'm trying to describe it to you, sometimes the best way to convey it is through figurative language. Someone says, oh, okay, yeah, I've seen that before. I've never seen mushrooms, but I have seen filing cabinets. But the other thing is the filing cabinets does is it opens up a whole new level of meaning. That could be very effective for changing and transforming the meaning in the poem. So that's interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about figurative language since we just brought it up. So figurative language, like you said, Matt, a simile. It's hard to avoid similes. Similes are really tempting with pretty much everything because it's saying what something is like, which is often how we as humans understand things. What does it feel like? Feeling is actually a thing. It's a sensory, there are all these sensory receptors involved in feeling, but we don't really understand what feeling means. So we say what something feels like. It's as if, we're scientists trying to learn what something is like. I want to learn more about those mushrooms that we're looking at, and I'm trying to learn more about it by thinking what it is similar to. It's a way of getting at the nature of reality by walking around it instead of going straight to the it. So a metaphor, people, well, it's the same thing, but it's without using like or as. But I think what's more interesting about metaphor is that it does have a different feeling in a poem to me. When there's a comparison, it's just, two things are side by side. This is like this. It's not that, but it's like it. But a metaphor actually allows the thing to become that. And transformation is inherent in metaphor. The word itself is based on a word for transport in Greek. So it really is about something becoming something else. So it feels more, it feels alive. It feels like the transformation is actually physically happening rather than just being suggested as a descriptor. So it's an implied comparison. I just want to let you all know that I was going to show some poems and talk through them and talk about how image works. And then I realized I didn't really have time and I didn't want to get into permissions issues. And because, this is public and I know it's not a big deal, but anyway, as a writer, I work a lot in that field as well when I support other people in copyright permissions. So I decided I would use some of my own lines. So that's what I've done here. I also, in the process of doing this, thought, okay, I want to share with you my own, when I look back on things I've written, I'm very critical of it. And as I was looking for figurative language to bring into this workshop, all I could think was, well, that's a really badly written line. So we're going to talk about those lines. I'm revealing them to you. I'm like, this was not a good line. Some of them were, some of them aren't. So an example here, I wanted to just show two examples. One metaphor, history's worn stone steps, where history actually becomes, it's not so much that history becomes the steps, but history becomes an idea of a stairwell, you know, something climbing up or down. And I think of worn stone steps as kind of ancient stone. So history actually is understood to be worn stone steps. It's not like worn stone steps. Idea of the simile is we're sleep to moor like once my mastless boat. So if only sleep could moor, which in itself is a metaphor. Even where sleep to moor is itself a metaphor because it's already turning sleep into something that can be moored like a boat does. But I'm using the word like to extend it further to suggest the boat being mastless. So those are just two examples. Metonymy and synecdoche are two things that I often get confused, but it's basically a lot of it is in our regular language that we just like, you know, if you like it, put a ring on it, that, you know, that song. So put a ring on it is a metonymic. The finger becomes the metonym for the marriage in this case, right? A synecdoche is when you use a part to represent the whole or vice versa. So, you know, I asked the farmhands if they had any extra milk. You know, the farmhands, the hands is the stand-in for all those who are working on the farm. So it's a part that represents the whole. Personification, there's giving human characteristics to non-human things or to abstractions. Even a lot of the names, the literal names that English, for example, has for something, or Latin names themselves are personifications. The weeping willow, it's a personification. And then synesthesia, we mentioned that earlier, the conscious mixing of two different types of sensory experience. So if you taste something when you touch a texture, and synesthesia can create really rich imagery, like the silver sheen of her humming. So we hear humming, but we hear it as if it's something visible. That leads me into something I'm really fascinated with, which is how poems, how imagery in poems are not static. They almost refuse to be static. Even if you're writing just the literal image of this is describing the mushroom. Because that image is in a poem, it's infused with everything else that the poem is doing. It's also contributing to meaning that everything else that the poem is doing. So it cannot be static. It's always going to be changed by and change the landscape within which it exists, the landscape of the poem. When you're adding, because the image is not static, it's always in motion. And I'm really interested in those images that you can't quite, like you could not paint it. You couldn't draw it, you couldn't photograph it. It actually cannot be seen, but you can picture it in your head, but the way you picture it is somewhat like, it's that image that's impossible, right? The silver sheen of her humming is kind of an impossible picture because what is sheen? Sheen looks like something, but how can you actually depict the sound through a visual? So those are some of the most interesting images to me. And since this class is like how to make a transformative image, images in poetry are already transformative. So how to increase the transformative capacity of the imagery in your poetry. That's kind of what we were talking about. And synesthesia is one way to do that. Okay, so now, many of you have already done this. So now the challenge is if you maybe want to expand on the figurative language you've already given these images. So for each image, write at least one figurative description. And again, think about all the elements of the image and what they remind you of, what associations come up. And sometimes it's not the image itself, but it's how the image is acting. So like the train seems to be in motion. What does the motion of the train remind you of if the train itself doesn't have a figure for it, for example? So think about all the other things in this image that you might want to create associations from. So again, I will give you maybe 3 minutes on this one. Okay. Okay. Okay, so now the next part of this exercise, the third part, um, is about combining the literal and the figurative um, for each description, but not just that, but then bringing both of the images into the same world. How might, if both of these themes, both of the if you have worlds of each image and your world for each image includes literal description and figurative description, how might you bring them into the same piece, the same poem, the same universe? So I'll give you a minute or two just to think, maybe make some notes of how would you combine these? What correspondences do you find between these two? Because sometimes the correspondences, the associations between two images, two things occur within the process of finding the correspondences for each one. Does that make sense? The way you might have imagined the mushrooms and the tree, and the way you might have imagined and explained the train through the city, you might find that there's meeting points and junctures in the descriptions themselves rather than the original thing. So I'll give you a minute to just brainstorm some of those correspondences between the two pictures. Okay, let's stop there for now. I'm excited by the possibility of really unusual combinations, things that I think I can't imagine those two things being like one another or helping to illuminate the other thing. But that's where poetry can be really exciting, because everything is connected as it is anyway, right? So poetry is where you can really play with deepening the awareness of those connections, the awareness of those replications. Does anyone have something they'd like to share? I'm really happy to read, Rachel, in the chat. You talked about some of the metaphors you found with your infant son's tender peach-colored ears. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone want to share something that they thought about looking at these two, thinking about the correspondences between these two pictures, whether it's a line you wrote or just an experience you had?
For me, it was, I don't know, I guess the light. And even with the cityscape and the train, like there's still light, a natural light to it. And so like what you said, everything is connected. And because I couldn't see the two together, but the light does connect them for me.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else?
A couple things. The color of the light in the cityscape and the fungi are the same color, that kind of golden color, but in such a different environment. And I just started getting this point, like looking at the two together, this train snaking through the city, and then like I was a bird navigating around the fungi, and then it started to kind of feel like a similarity in the two images.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. Navigation. That's neat. Yeah. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Haley, for your comment in the chat. Yeah, I'll read it for you if it's okay, since you have a sore throat. That one thing Haley says I see is that both urban train and mushroom colonies have extensive networks that are largely unseen. And I also see that each feature climbing, one vertically and one horizontally. Oh, that's very cool. I didn't notice that. That's great. There's so much material just in these images. Anybody else?
Hi, it's
Hi.
Bhavna. I actually went to questions. I think, Jennifer, you were talking about questions
Yeah.
earlier in the class.
Mhm.
And I have, was the forest used to make the city? How does the city remember the forest?
That's beautiful. Those are beautiful questions. Oh, I love that. You know, the way that poems live inside questions and come from questions, and questions like that that don't have an answer, but that open to new ideas and new associations, new feelings. Yeah, that's rich. Thank you. And also thinking about, you know, I realized, well, I selected these images, so I had all this stuff going on in my mind around like, what do I put next to this one? And I was looking at stock images, of course, and so then so in a way, like you're interacting with images that already involved my correspondences, things that I noticed in the two, that I liked how they looked next to each other. So that's just an interesting other element too of thinking about ekphrastic poetry when you write about, you know, a work of art, but how we can use what we see and transform it into a completely different, that you may end up with a poem from the writing you've done that have nothing, they don't actually have a train or a mushroom in it. But some of the associations, if you think about the rhizomes, you know, just like how mushrooms are, some of the things that come out of the correspondences or the questions might be where the poem lives, right? So if you begin a poem saying, I want to write a poem about a train and a mushroom, you might end up with something completely different. So another example of letting go of your original impulse, your original idea, and being open to the poem that happens that you don't predict. Okay, so I wanted to just, this was one poem I know I can show, it's in the public domain, but also I think it's a great example of an image poem by H.D. Hilda Doolittle, who was kind of known as an imagist poem. And well, I won't go on to that because of time. But this is an example, I think, of how figurative language, or actually, I would say this is not quite figurative. It combines literal and figurative to create a transformation. Whirl up sea, whirl your pointed pines, splash your great pines on our rocks, hurl your green over us, cover us with your pools of fur. To me, this is an example of a poet asking a question of the thing she's looking at. And in that process of asking the question or giving this, it feels like it's a command. The language is a command, do this, but it feels like an entreaty, a very kind of humble submission to the power of the sea. But what's interesting is the two things that are being associated is sea and like a forest of pine trees, which feel like very different things. So I just want you to hold this in your mind when we're going to talk about the next thing. It's just two aspects of metaphor, little technical stuff here. So you may have heard of the tenor and vehicle as a way to talk about metaphor. So here again is one of my round lines. My mother's ribs were icicles. It's a very simple sentence. There's a subject, my mother's ribs, and then the thing that they become are icicles. And it's a really simple metaphor because all I'm doing is saying my mother's ribs were icicles. I could have said my mother's ribs were like icicles, and then I took out like and made it the simile a metaphor. So they actually become the icicles. My problem with this line is that it's not as dynamic as it could be. I just say this is this. But I don't build in so much of the experience to kind of make that transformation persuasive or effective. Sometimes that's not needed depending on how you're building your poem. But anyway, it's an example. And I thought, here we go. The tenor is the figure of speech, the tenor of the figure of speech, right? The figure is my mother's ribs or icicles, is the thing that's being described. The concrete image that the tenor is linked to is called the vehicle. Note that I say concrete image because it really needs concrete diction for it to work. You could say my mother's ribs were love. I mean, that can kind of work, but it doesn't really transform because we still don't know what love is, right? So the vehicle, the vehicle is the figurative language being used to describe the thing. Okay, so tenor is mother's ribs, vehicle is icicle. Another example, your gaze like an axe, my throat of bark. There's two things. I have the simile, your gaze like an axe, and my throat of bark. So I have a simile and a metaphor. Here's a third one. Oops, sorry. The people concealed her seeds, stars dull hatchets, behind the black bark of the moon. So I'm connecting seeds to stars, dull hatchets, which in itself is a metaphor embedded in a metaphor. The stars are being likened to dull hatchets, which is then being likened to seeds. So you're embedding metaphors within other metaphors. And then I'm extending it with behind the black bark of the moon, which again, I'm embedding two metaphors in that. It's not just behind the moon, but now I'm likening the moon to a tree with black bark. And the moon is the black bark. So there's a lot of figurative language going on in that line. So we'll spend a little time with this slide because these are a few kind of suggestions for ways that you can really increase the transformational capacity of your imagery in the poem. knowing that an image is already transformed by being in the poem alone and is transforming other things in the poem because of association. So one thing is, oftentimes similes can become more active when you do turn them into a metaphor. My example of my mother's ribs were icicles, it's not a very good one because already, well, anyway, but one way, if you actually allow the thing to become the thing rather than say it's like that, it has a different effect in the poem. And there's a place for both. There's a reason where you may not want the thing to actually become the thing. You want it to stay parallel, just next to each other. But oftentimes you can put more energy into the thing if you just turn it into a metaphor directly, make a direct association. So not only removing like or as, like I did, my mother's ribs are icicle, but actually adding details to make that association more persuasive, which I did not do with my mother's ribs or icicles, but you could add details to make the thing fully transformed. So we actually believe that that thing can be the other thing. So an easy solution, instead of your gaze like an axe, you could just say your gaze, comma, an axe. Sometimes just putting in the comma as a placeholder and it works. So that's one easy solution. But if you want to go further and make it more interesting, you might, instead of just saying this is this, you might actually want to show us the transformation. So, you know, an example, you raised your gaze's glinting blade. We still don't know if it's an axe, but a glinting blade is becoming the axe. An axe angled for splitting wood. I'm getting more information put in there. So now there's a lot more than just your gaze as an axe, but we actually see the gaze doing something as an axe might do and doing something to something else. I want to talk about this next one, creating more tension. So we talked about tenor and vehicle. The tenor is the thing and the vehicle is the figurative language being used to transform that thing. Your gaze is the thing, the axe is the gaze is the tenor, the axe is the vehicle. Another way to think about that is ground and tension. The ground is the thing that the tenor and vehicle share. It's what they have in common. If there's too much ground, the metaphor won't be surprising. So if they're too much alike one another, right? They share too much in common, then we lose the element of surprise. Too little ground can create a tenuous relationship. If there isn't enough information there, one may not, it might just seem like an easy thing to say. This thing is that thing. You know, it's not persuasive. The reader may not get into it with you, you know, and really they're not experiencing it as fully. So there's always this thing about the tension in the ground, you know, ratcheting up the tension just a bit so that they're different enough, but not too much that they can't be experienced. So another thing to be cautious of is one of the easy ways we can make metaphors is using of, and you might have found that in your own writing. My throat of bark, right? And I realized I did that twice, the black bark of the moon. These are in two different books. I must have this obsession, right? My throat of bark and the black bark of the moon. I just discovered this. So it's terrible. But anyway, I thought, well, I do that of thing a lot. In my second book, I actually did a practice where I went through and found all the of constructions, the throat of bark, the bark of the moon, and highlighted them and counted how many I had. And there were so many, I was more mortified. So I tried to change as many of them as possible. Now there's a lot of place and time for the of construction, and it can be really powerful in a poem, but just something to be aware of, like everything you do in your poetry, to be aware of, am I relying on the of too much to create that metaphor? And if I am, what else can I do instead of the of? Like I was trying to do in the sentence, you raised your gaze's glinting blade and axe angled for splitting wood. I was trying to avoid using the of. Don't avoid it all the time. It's an important function word, of, and it's really useful creating metaphors. The fourth point, or the fourth kind of tip, is to extend the vehicle further. Every time you think, well, I've made a really cool metaphor, your gaze, an axe, that's cool. Challenge yourself to push it further, push it beyond the boundaries of itself. So keep going. So I had a really bad example that has no rhythm at all. But this was just me last night trying to give an example of this. So you raised your gaze's glinting blade an axe, angled for splitting the wood to warm the house where my children slept with snowmen's wet coal eyes. So it's really just keep on going. You raise your gaze as glinting blade and axe. Okay, well, what is the axe doing? It's angled. What is it angled for? It's angled for splitting the wood. What is the wood for? The wood is to warm the house. What happens in the house? The house is where my children are sleeping. How are they sleeping? With snowmen's wet coal eyes. You can keep going like that forever. But that's a way to extend the vehicle further and push the sentence forward and add a lot of energy and transformation into the original thing. So those are 4 little tips. Now, some of you who've been in my classes have heard me talk a lot about appositives. So I'm going to talk about that here again. Apposition is when you put one thing beside another. So this is just a grammar term. But it's helpful to be able to identify positives at work in your lines, because you can fill in places where there aren't appositives to extend that figure. So an appositive is a word or group of words that explains the original or the subject in greater detail. So here's some examples. So what I did here is I put brackets around the subject and the object. So the simple sentence, my mother's ribs is the subject. They became icicles. A positive basically explains the original in greater detail. Simple as that. So I added an appositive in between the subject and the object to extend it. My mother's ribs, as she leaned across the watercolor canvas, were icicles. If I continued, I could say were icicles that da-da-da-da-da. What do icicles do? Now you can go further. That would be an appositive too. So it's just adding information to explain the original in greater detail. Another example, my stomach is a canvas. So here's the line. Stomach is a stretched canvas. So stretched, just adding that adjective makes that an appositive too. You're now not just is your stomach a canvas, how is it a canvas? Well, it's a stretched canvas. That adds a little more detail. So that's an appositive. What kind of canvas is it? I'm going to say it's a canvas of winter. That's another appositive. The third appositive is, what about that? Well, it's a winter where birds spit skin onto the browning grass. I've just added a whole nother level of context. First of all, it becomes a metaphor, a canvas of winter, but then notice the of construction again. See how handy that of is? It can be too handy. A canvas of winter. Okay, well, what happens on that canvas of winter? Well, it's a place. It's a place where birds are spitting. What are they spitting? They're spitting skin. So you get the idea, right? So positives are just ways to extend and expand with more information. And try to go as far as you can with your, if you're really wanting to, you might end up then paring back and saying, well, this is taking me away from what I wanted to be doing in this stanza of the poem. But it's something, if you're stuck, you can always work with appositives. Any questions about that, the appositive? Okay. So this is kind of the last exercise. But so what I'd like you to do is go back to where you wrote 5 nouns and also 5 adjectives and 5 verbs, and put the nouns into the chat box. If you did more than 5, just choose 5 that you like. If you didn't come up with 5, just put 1 or 2. You just need a few nouns to work with. Okay. These are great. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. We'll go back to the screen because it has the instructions, but this way you can take a moment instead of looking at the PowerPoint and scroll through this list. And I want you to choose 3 that stick out to you? Just choose 3 of someone else's nouns. Okay, everyone have 3? 3? Okay, they're such good ones. Compass, make believe. Oh, I always feel whenever I just get given a bunch of words, so grateful. Because words are hard to come up with. There's so much you could do with all of each word has all these associations, you know. Willow. Okay. So now that you have 3 words from this list, or more, you know, but we'll just work with 3 right now. I'll go back to this exercise. Okay. So now, oh, I said 5. Well, anyway, 3. We really only need 3. I think that's what I meant. So from these that you chose, I'm going to ask you to write 3 simple sentences with a tenor and a vehicle. And the challenge is to allow the vehicle of the first sentence to become the tenor for another vehicle. And this may be, if you chose 3 words, it might be, you know, let's see, the paper is an umbrella. The umbrella is a globe. A globe is a maple leaf or something like that. So that's the activity first. So I'll let you do that. And also you can substitute as you write these lines. You know, you start with the simple line, this is this, but you might want to substitute the verb is with something else. The globe becomes a paper plate. The globe grows into a, you know, you don't have to use is, you're free to change that. So the first challenge is to see if there's any, you know, if a globe becomes a paper plate, is there any resonance there that you can find? Is there anything that you can imagine of how that thing can be another thing? It may be that in the process of doing that, you don't find anything that really is inspiring to you, but you think of something else, right? You think of, okay, the globe is not a paper plate, but the globe makes me think of this, or the paper plate makes me think of this, right? So keeping track of those associations, where your mind goes, is an important part of the process. But once you have 3 constructions, this is this, and then the this is something else. So you're basically extending each vehicle to become the tenor for something else. This is another way to kind of extend your line, extend your image. So much so that by the time we get to Z, we've kind of forgotten what A is, but it's connected. Z has been born out of A somehow. So now the work is to, you know, build out these associations to help kind of generate ground or similarity between these objects while trying to maintain some kind of tension so that they're interesting metaphors. And you might do that you would do that actually by adding appositives, adding more information. The A, da 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 da, is in the room with X, that is feeling like, you know what I mean, that you're adding in information to kind of allow that transformation to happen. And just to give a little more constraint, use the 5 adjectives and the 5 verbs that you generated at the beginning of class as well, just your own. Find a way to use each of those adjectives and each of those verbs. And you can do the positives in multiple directions. So think of how you can, I don't want to be too grammar technical, but instead of beginning with the object, the A, the globe is a paper plate, you might add in a positive before the subject by say, suspended from the attic ceiling, the globe, right? You're adding an information about the globe before you mention the object. So that's like putting in a positive previous to the subject. So think about putting in positives in both directions and in between. So I'll give you a few minutes to play with this, to come up with kind of a sequence and to brainstorm this transformation. Okay, so I could probably work on this for quite a long time. I know I could. What I would suggest with this kind of exercise is to try and stay within the parameters as much as possible, but also allow yourself for the things that change, right? Because what happens, at least what happens to me, if I have, the star is a bottle, the bottle is a piano, the piano is a meadow. Okay, I start imagining, okay, well, I start making associations with bottles, and those associations are going to change my feeling about the star. And then I have to take it to another place to imagine how a bottle is like a piano. So now I'm imagining associations with pianos. Where are the correspondences between bottles and pianos? There's all this stuff starts rushing in when I imagine that. I'd never put a bottle and a piano together, but associations start rushing in and crowding the page. Just take notes of those things, rather than trying to make this a particular line that is interesting. Keep track of the things that rush in and want to argue for a place in that line, because there are other poems in there that are trying to emerge all the time. It's like our dream life. Our dreams are so rich. And we have these long, extensive dreams where they feel that way, but they really only take like 2 seconds. I think it's like poetry is all this stuff is rushing in a split second. Just like what Ezra Pound said about the image, a complex, an emotional and intellectual complex in an instant of time. So our challenge as poets is that we imagine these things in instances, and yet we have to spend a long time. And also you can only do one word at a time on the page, right? So it's fascinating. But as you're revising this, to allow all that to come in, to keep track of it, but also on the other hand, to be looking for probably the associations, the chain of associations that feel the most exciting to you, the one that we get an enlarged, deeper meaning for A than we had in the first place, because A has now gone through all these transformations. It's become whatever bottle associates with, it's become whatever piano is, it's become a meadow. It's been so deeply enlarged that it has this, completely different meaning that you probably never intended in the first place. So this is really an exercise in how to find surprise in your own work and how to change your mind about what you think you want to write about. So does anyone have something they'd like to share? A cool moment in the process of this, or even just a line that you want to share? And you can share it or put it in the chat, whatever you wish. Oh, let's see, I have two. Oh, awesome. Oh, Annie, thanks for putting this in the chat. Hoards the glucose and sucrose sublight line. Those are great. The nighthawk thrown from Earth's geomagnetic field or the metallic saw. Oh, that's so cool. That's excellent. I love these things. Oh yeah, and you brought in your adjectives and verbs. That's great. I do think that when we give ourselves rules, they can really help to open things up. Otherwise, I often feel like I'm floundering in a sea of language. So if I'm looking for something, I say, oh, I have to use this verb. I have to use the word flounder. Then I'm going to kind of force and manipulate the language to kind of work. So it can be enriching to have more rules at times. Static kiss between chapped lips. These are great. Wow, thank you all. Thank you all for sharing some of this. That's excellent. Right. So just one last kind of slide here. Actually, did I even? Oh, screen sharing has stopped. Oops, I closed the window. Here we go. I have to go back to it. Which is basically just, here we go. Play from current slide. It's just some encouraging notes that everything you have in your notebook right now, you make sure you're looking at what I'm looking at. Yes. There is poetry in there, there's at least one line for a poem in there, or at least one image. Something that you can use at some point in your writing life is currently in your notes. I believe that. So a challenge for you might be just to choose one of these image complexes. I like to say image complex because it's a reminder that the image itself is not static. When it lives in the poem, it's a living, breathing thing that is a lot more than just what we think it is. It's a complex of associations. So choose one image complex and write into it, to find a poem. Allow an image to catalyze a poem rather than trying to write the poem about an idea or about an overwhelming feeling, like the melancholy. But begin with the image, as the aboutness, the meaning is going to reveal itself. Just like putting two very unlike things together and smashing these things together, you think that's never going to work. This thing can't be like this thing. But by putting them together, new things emerge. And so the meaning reveals itself to you rather than you controlling the meaning. And to note that with all of this said, I wanted to bring in this quote by James Longenbach, who was a great teacher of poetry and wrote a lot of, I think, really good craft books about poetry as well as poems. So one is called How Poems Are Made. I think it was just in 2019 from Norton. But I really like this line. It's a good reminder that image is not enough, that it's not the image alone that creates the transformation in the poem, but it's all the complexities that happen in poetry that are needed. Like when I gave you an example of a line, I took my line and I built into it and I said, don't write a line like this, at least write one with better rhythm. If the rhythm is lacking, you're also, that transformation is being compromised too. So James Longenbach wrote, what we call a line made of images would not be successful if the line did not simultaneously, in relationship to other lines, construct and disrupt a dynamically unfolding pattern of sounds. A reminder that poetry is about imagery. It also involves sound, it involves time, it involves structure, it involves all these things, patterns. So as you're working these images and going into the image to create the most transformative image, part of that revision process is also making considerations for sound, pattern, lineation, and all the other things that poetry works with as its tools. So I hope that this was useful, some of these ideas to think about. I just, I love thinking about these aspects of poetry in isolation and then remembering that they can't exist in isolation. They always have to involve all the other parts of the body, all the other parts of the poem body and the poem heart as well. I hope you've come up with a few lines or things that you can work with in your own poetry writing.